Victor Blackwell grabbed the infant out of Clara's arms before she could even cry out. She had just given birth hours ago. She was still bleeding. Her wrists were bound with rope that had cut through to raw skin, and she was lying on wet straw in the back of a wagon when he reached in, peeled that baby from her chest like he was picking up something he'd left on a shelf, and handed the bundle to a man on horseback without a word. Clara screamed. She screamed the kind of scream that doesn't sound human, the kind that tears up through your chest and shreds everything on the way out. She tried to grab the man's coat, his arm, anything, but her legs wouldn't hold and her wrists were chained, and Victor just looked down at her with those flat gray eyes and said, "Stop that noise. You'll get the rope." The baby didn't even cry. She was so small, so new, she didn't understand yet what kind of world she'd been born into. That was the last sound Clara heard from her daughter, a single small breath in the rain. If you've never heard of a story like this, you haven't been listening close enough. Subscribe to this channel and follow Clara's story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you. Hit that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The rain had been falling since sundown and showed no sign of stopping. The auction yard sat at the edge of Callow Creek, a frontier settlement that called itself a town, but was really just a collection of men who had decided to stop moving and start taking. There was a blacksmith, 2 saloons, a land office that doubled as a courthouse, and a platform of raw pine boards that had been built for occasions exactly like this one, when someone needed to be sold and the law had already looked the other way. Clara Whitmore stood on that platform in the rain with her wrists in irons and her feet bare against the wet wood and her body doing things bodies weren't supposed to do this soon after childbirth. She was 26 years old. She weighed maybe 100 pounds in those wet clothes. Her hair was plastered to her face and she couldn't push it out of her eyes because of the chains, so she just stood there half blind, listening to the auctioneer read off her qualities like he was describing a horse. "Strong back," the man was saying. He was short and wide, and he held a lantern up near her face in a way that made her want to close her eyes. "Good teeth. Some medical history, but nothing that'll slow her down once she's recovered. Previous owner vouches for her work in the kitchen and the field both." "How old?" someone called from the crowd. 26. "She look older than that." "That's the weather," the auctioneer said, and a few men laughed. Clara didn't move. She had stopped letting herself react to things like that about 6 months ago, when she'd learned that reacting was how they kept score. You flinch, they know they got you. You cry, they feel powerful. So she had trained herself to go somewhere else inside her own head while her body stood there and took whatever came. She was getting good at it. Some days she worried she was getting too good at it. Victor Blackwell stood at the edge of the torchlight with his arms folded and a look on his face like a man watching cattle prices. He was 40-something, lean in the way that meant he'd never missed a meal, but didn't waste anything on comfort either. He wore a good coat, the kind that said money without shouting about it, and he had the kind of stillness about him that made other men nervous. Not because he was violent, though he was when he needed to be, but because he was always calculating, always 3 steps ahead of whatever you thought the conversation was about. He had owned Clara's contract for 14 months. Before that, she'd belonged to a logging outfit up north that had gone under when the foreman died. Before that, it was a family in Missouri who'd taken her in after her parents were killed crossing the Dakotas, and who'd decided after about 6 months that taking someone in didn't mean letting them leave. The frontier had a long history of that kind of mathematics. She didn't know what Victor was getting for her tonight. She didn't know what the bid would be or who would win it. She knew only that her daughter was already gone, and that whatever happened next was going to happen without her being consulted about it, which was how things had worked for as long as she could remember. The bidding started at $40. She watched the crowd without really seeing it. Torches, rain, the smell of horses and wet wool and wood smoke, men in hats that dripped water off the brims. She counted faces the way she'd learned to do, looking for the ones that meant danger, the ones that meant indifference, the ones that might be something else. It was a survival skill. Most of the faces tonight were indifferent. 2 or 3 meant danger. She filed that away without letting it show. 50, someone said. 55. 60. The auctioneer was warming up, swinging the lantern a little, playing to the crowd. "Come on, gentlemen, skilled laborer. References provided. This is a bargain at twice the price." "She's sick?" the first voice said again. She's standing funny. She's tired, the auctioneer said. Long day. Claire's knees were doing something she didn't like. There was a warmth spreading down her left leg that she knew wasn't rain, and she understood clinically what it meant. And she also understood that if she fell on this platform in front of these men, it would be the end of something in her she was trying to keep alive. So she locked her knees and breathed through her teeth and stayed upright by the force of pure stubbornness, which was the one resource she'd never run out of. Victor hadn't moved from his spot. He was watching the bidding with that same flat attention he brought to everything. Whatever he'd already been paid for the baby had apparently been enough to put Claire on the block separately, which meant he was squeezing 2 transactions out of one night and feeling pretty good about the efficiency of it. That was Victor. Never left money on the table. 75. 80. The man who'd been bidding at 80 had the look of a ranch foreman. Thick through the shoulders, boots that had seen real work, a face that didn't give much away. Clara watched him. He wasn't cruel, she didn't think. Cruel men usually smile too much at these things, or not at all. This one just looked like he was buying something he needed and didn't much enjoy needing it. That was better than most. Not good, but better than most. Then a voice came from the back of the crowd. $120. The bidding stopped. Not just slowed, stopped, like someone had cut the sound out of the air. The auctioneer actually lowered his lantern and squinted toward the darkness where the voice had come from, and the men in the crowd turned, and Clara turned too, because even she wanted to see who in this town had just said a number like that. He came forward slowly. Not the slow of a man making an entrance, the slow of a man who moved at exactly the pace he decided to move at, and didn't particularly care what anyone thought about it. He was tall, broad across the chest, maybe 35 or close to it. He wore a plain work coat, nothing special, and his hat was pushed back a little like he'd forgotten to straighten it. He had a face that had been outside in all kinds of weather for a long time, and dark eyes that moved across the crowd the same way Clara had been doing, taking stock, filing things away. He walked up to within 10 feet of the platform and looked at her. Not at her like the others had been looking at her. He looked at her the way you look at a person, like she had a face instead of a value. Clara didn't know what to do with that, so she looked back at him steadily and said nothing. $120, the auctioneer repeated, like he needed to hear it again to believe it. Do I hear 130? Nobody said anything. Victor Blackwell unfolded his arms. For the first time all evening, something shifted in his face. Not quite surprised, but close. He was looking at the tall man with an expression Clara couldn't quite read, and she had gotten pretty good at reading Victor. $120, the auctioneer said again, going once. $125, the foreman-looking man said, but he said it without conviction, like a man who knows he's already lost. $150, the tall man said. Done. Sold, the auctioneer said, and banged his hand against the platform railing because he didn't have a gavel. To the gentleman in the back. The crowd let out a breath. Someone made a joke Clara didn't catch. The foreman-looking man spat in the mud and walked away. Victor was already moving toward the new buyer, hand extended, because a transaction was a transaction, and Victor was always professional about that part. Clara stood on the platform and watched the tall man reach into his coat and count out bills into Victor's hand. He didn't look happy about it. He didn't look like a man making a celebration purchase. He looked like a man doing something he decided needed doing, and getting it done. Victor took the money. He shook the man's hand. He said something Clara couldn't hear over the rain, and the man nodded once, and then Victor glanced up at Clara on the platform with that flat gaze of his, the look that said you are a completed transaction, and walked away into the dark. The auctioneer came to unlock her chains. His hand smelled like tobacco, and he didn't look at her face while he worked the key. Step down careful, he said. Platform's slick. Clara stepped down. Her legs held. She was absurdly proud of that. The tall man was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Up close, he was bigger than he'd looked from the platform, and the dark eyes were even harder to read. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at her feet. You don't have shoes, he said. They took them, Clara said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She hadn't spoken to anyone in 2 days except to answer questions. He nodded like that was information he was storing somewhere. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a folded piece of cloth. A shirt, she realized, an extra one he'd had bundled there, and held it out to her. Put this around your feet best you can until we get to the horse. Ground's bad out there. She stared at the shirt. Or don't, he said. Your choice. She took the shirt. His name was Ethan Ward. She learned while he helped her onto his horse, carefully, without grabbing, with his hands going where he said they would go before he moved them, which was a thing she noticed. He had a ranch up in the North Hills, 6 hours' ride in good weather. Tonight was not good weather, so it would be longer. There was a woman there, an older Navajo woman named Sarah, who kept house for him, who would be able to help Clara more than he could. Help me how? Clara said. Medically, he said, if you need it. She looked at his profile in the dark. You know what I just went through? I guessed some of it, he said. I talked to a few people before the auction. And you still paid that much? He didn't answer right away. The horse moved steadily through the rain and mud, picking its way out of Callow Creek and onto the road north. And Ethan Ward sat behind her with his hands holding the reins on either side of her without touching her and seemed to be deciding something. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said finally. Clara had been alive for 26 years, and she could not remember the last time someone had done something because it seemed like the right thing. She filed that away too, next to the question of who this man was and what he actually wanted. Because in her experience, there was always something people actually wanted. Where's my daughter? She said. He was quiet for a long moment. Too long. I don't know, he said. Do you know who bought her? I know who handled the transaction on Blackwell's side. I don't know who the buyer was. Could find out, maybe. Maybe. Maybe is better than no. Clara didn't say anything. The rain hit her face and she let it, because she was so tired of flinching away from things that were just going to hit her anyway. They rode for a while without talking. The road climbed as they got away from the creek bottom, and the rain came sideways up here in the hills, and Ethan's horse was steady and unfussy about it, the way horses get when they've been through a lot of bad weather and decided it isn't worth getting upset about anymore. Why do you have a ranch out here? Clara said eventually. Got tired of being somewhere else, he said. That's not an answer. It's the honest one. She turned her head a little to look at him sideways. You paid $150 for a person you never met. You called it the right thing to do. You don't explain yourself. What are you? Something moved in his face that might have been the beginning of a smile. Tired, mostly. Of what? Watching things happen that shouldn't happen, he said, and then finding reasons why they weren't my problem. Clara faced forward again. The horse moved. The rain kept coming. I'm not going to work for you, she said. I need you to know that up front. I'll figure out what I owe you, and I'll figure out how to pay it back. But I'm not going to belong to anyone again. I know that, he said. You say that now. I'll say it tomorrow, too. Men say all kinds of things when they want something. Yes, they do, he agreed, without any heat in it. And I'm not going to tell you to trust me because you've got no reason to, and saying trust me to someone in your situation is... He stopped. It would be a stupid thing to say, so I'm not saying it. Clara was quiet. I'm going to take you somewhere dry and warm, he said. Sarah's going to look at you and make sure you're not... He stopped again. Make sure you're all right. And after that, what you do is up to you. I don't know this territory. No. I can't ride. I noticed. I'll teach you. She turned to look at him again. Why? He met her eyes briefly in the dark. Because a person who can ride can go anywhere they want to go. Seems like something you should have. Clara turned back around. She felt something shifting in her chest, something she didn't trust and didn't want to name, because hope had been the thing that had gotten her hurt the most times in her life, and she was running out of versions of herself that could survive getting hurt again. But she also noticed, somewhere in the back of her mind, that she was still upright, still breathing, still making choices, even if the choices were small ones, even if the best choice she'd had all night was which foot to put down first on wet wood. She was still here. The ranch appeared out of the dark and rain like something you weren't sure was real, a long, low house, a barn, lamplight in one window. Ethan whistled twice as they approached, and after a moment the front door opened and a figure stood there with a lamp, backlit and waiting. That would be Sarah. Clara straightened her back. Whatever this was, it was not what she had expected. Whatever this man was, he was not what she had expected. She didn't know yet if that was good. But she had been through enough nights on the frontier to know that something not being what you expected was at least a different kind of problem than the ones she already knew how to have. And sometimes a different problem was all you were ever going to get. The horse stopped in front of the barn. Ethan dismounted and came around to her side without rushing. He held up his hand, not grabbing, just offering. Clara looked at his hand for a moment, then she took it and got down. Her feet hit the ground and held, and she was still standing, still breathing, still here, in the rain on a hill in a territory she didn't know, in the company of a stranger who'd paid good money for her and then told her she owed him nothing, and for one terrifying, unexpected, unwelcome moment, she felt something crack open in the wall she'd spent years building inside her chest. She turned away from him fast before he could see her face. "Come on then," she said. "Let's go inside." Sarah didn't say much when they came through the door. She looked at Clara the way a person looks at a wound, not with pity, not with horror, just with the focused attention of someone who needed to understand the damage before they could do anything about it. She was maybe 60, with gray-streaked hair pulled back tight and hands that moved with the kind of certainty that comes from having handled hard things for a long time. She took one look at Clara's feet, at the makeshift wrapping of Ethan's shirt soaked through with mud and blood, and turned to Ethan and said something short and sharp in a language Clara didn't know. Ethan nodded once and disappeared toward the back of the house. "Sit," Sarah said to Clara. Not unkind, but not gentle either, just direct. Clara sat down on the bench nearest the fire because her legs had finally decided they were done pretending, and she didn't have the energy to argue with them. The warmth from the fire hit her all at once, and she had to press her lips together hard to keep from making a sound, because warmth after that much cold and wet and fear does something to a person's composure that cold never could. Sarah knelt in front of her and began unwrapping the shirt from her feet without asking permission, which Clara appreciated more than she could have explained. She was tired of being asked things. She was tired of having to decide whether each question was safe to answer. "How long ago?" Sarah said. "This morning," Clara said. "Before dawn." Sarah's hands paused for just half a second. Then they kept moving. "The child?" "Gone." Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm sorry." Clara looked at the fire. "Don't." Sarah looked up at her. Something passed between them that wasn't quite understanding, but was at least the acknowledgement that understanding wasn't possible, and that pretending otherwise would be an insult to both of them. Sarah went back to work. Ethan came back with a basin of water and some cloth, set them on the floor near Sarah without being asked, and then straightened up and looked at Clara. "I'll be in the barn if you need anything," he said. "You don't have to leave your own house," Clara said. "I know I don't," he said, and went anyway. She listened to the door close behind him. Then she looked at Sarah, who was cleaning the rope burns on her wrists with an expression of focused concentration, and something that might have been anger, though not at Clara. "He always like that?" Clara said. "Like what?" "Leaves the room so you don't have to ask him to." Sarah glanced up briefly. "Mostly." "Why?" "You'd have to ask him." "I'm asking you." Sarah was quiet for a moment, wrapping a strip of clean cloth around Clara's left wrist. "His mother was brought to a place she didn't choose," she said finally. "Long time ago. Different circumstances. Same general idea." She tied off the bandage. "He doesn't talk about it, but a person doesn't forget a thing like that, even when they're too young to understand it at the time." Clara absorbed that. Outside, the rain kept coming, and somewhere in the barn she could hear the muffled sounds of Ethan moving around, taking care of the horse, doing the ordinary things that still needed doing no matter what kind of night it had been. "Is he going to want something?" Clara said. "Eventually." Sarah sat back on her heels and looked at her straight. "That's something you're going to have to decide for yourself," she said. "I can tell you what I've seen in 7 years of living on this land, but what you do with that is yours." "Tell me then." "I've seen him ride 2 days through a blizzard to bring a neighbor's cattle back when the neighbor was too sick to do it himself. I've seen him give 2 months' wages to a family whose house burned down, people he barely knew. I've seen him lose his temper exactly twice, and both times it was because someone was hurting something smaller than them." Sarah looked at Clara's wrists. "I have never seen him take something that wasn't offered." Clara said nothing. That's what I've seen, Sarah said. You'll see what you see. She slept in a room off the kitchen that Sarah prepared with the efficient speed of someone who'd done it before. Not for Clara specifically, but for people who showed up needing a place to land. The bed was narrow, and the blanket was heavy wool, and Clara lay on her back staring at the ceiling with her body doing its slow, miserable inventory of everything that hurt, which was most things. She did not think about her daughter. She couldn't. Not yet. That was a door she could not open in the dark in a stranger's house, when she had no power to do anything about what was behind it. She had learned that lesson the hard way, that there was a difference between grief that moved you forward and grief that just swallowed you whole, and that at some point you had to choose which kind you were going to let yourself have. Tonight was not the night for either. She thought about Ethan Ward instead, because thinking about him was at least a problem she might be able to solve. She turned him over in her mind the way you turn a rock over to see what's underneath. $150. A ranch 6 hours north of Callow Creek. A mother who was brought somewhere she didn't choose. A man who left the room without being asked. People did things for reasons. Always. The trick was figuring out which reason was the real one. She was still working on it when sleep took her somewhere around the time the rain finally stopped. She woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of someone moving in the kitchen, and for one disorienting moment she didn't know where she was, and then she did, and both feelings were worse than the other in different ways. She lay still for a minute, taking stock. Her body had opinions about the night before. None of them were good. She got up anyway. Sarah was at the stove. Ethan was at the table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a week's worth of accounts spread out in front of him, and he was frowning at a column of numbers with the expression of a man who had not made friends with arithmetic and had given up trying. He looked up when Clara came in. "Coffee's hot," he said. "I can see that." She poured herself a cup and stood at the counter to drink it because she wasn't ready to sit at his table yet, and he didn't comment on it, just went back to his numbers with that frown. "What time is it?" she said. "Past 9. You needed it." "I didn't ask your opinion about what I needed." He looked up again, not offended, not apologetic either, just looking at her the same way he'd looked at her on the platform, like she was a person who'd said a thing and he was processing it. "Fair enough," he said. Sarah put a plate of food on the counter next to Clara without ceremony, eggs and some kind of flatbread, and Clara ate standing up because her legs were feeling better and she wanted to be able to move quickly if she needed to, which was a habit that would probably take a long time to break. "I need to find out who bought my daughter," she said when she'd eaten half the plate. Ethan didn't look up from his papers immediately. "I know." "Can you find out?" "I've already sent a message to a man in Callow Creek who keeps track of those things. Took the boy down the hill at first light." He paused. "We'll hear back in a few days, maybe less." Clara set down her fork. "You did that before I asked." Seemed like it needed doing. She stared at him. He was still looking at his papers, or pretending to. She couldn't tell if he was deliberately avoiding her gaze or genuinely absorbed in numbers he clearly hated. "What do you want from me?" she said. "And don't say nothing. Nobody does nothing." He put down his pen, folded his hands on the table and looked at her directly, which she had to admit he was consistent about. He looked at her like she was worth looking at, and it was both easier and harder than being looked through. "I want you to get better," he said, "and I want you to find your daughter if she's findable. After that, I don't have a want that involves you specifically." "And the money you paid?" "Forget the money." "I won't forget the money." "Then pay it back when you have it. Or don't. It's not why I did it." "Then why?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, thinking. She'd already learned the difference between those two silences in him, which bothered her a little, that she was already learning his silences. "I've ridden through Callow Creek a dozen times in the last 3 years," he said. "I've seen things I didn't stop. Kept telling myself it wasn't my business, the law was the law, I didn't know the full situation." He looked down at his hands. "Last night, I happened to be there for a specific reason, and I saw what was being done, and I had money in my pocket, and I was just—" He stopped. "I was tired of the list of things I told myself weren't my business." Clara looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away and he didn't add anything, and that was the thing about it. He didn't try to make himself sound better than what he'd said. He didn't clean it up. "That's an honest answer," she said finally. "It's the only kind I have." She picked up her fork and finished her eggs. The days that followed were strange, in the way that quiet is strange after a long time of noise. Your nervous system doesn't trust it. Clara spent the first 3 days mostly in the room off the kitchen, sleeping more than she expected, letting Sarah change the bandages on her wrists and bring her broth, and not ask questions. The physical recovery was faster than she'd feared and slower than she wanted. Her body was stubborn about it. She'd push too hard one day and wake up the next, unable to sit up without her vision going gray at the edges, and then she'd spend the day furious at herself, which didn't help anything. Ethan left her alone. Not pointedly. Not in the way that was itself a kind of pressure, the way some people made their absence into a statement. He just went about the work of the ranch and didn't make a production of not bothering her. She could hear him from the window sometimes, talking to Sarah or to the horses or occasionally to himself, and his voice was low and unhurried, and she hated a little bit how much she'd already started using the sound of it as a way to know where he was in relation to where she was. On the 4th day, she got up and went outside. The ranch sat in a shallow valley with hills on 3 sides, good grass, a creek running down from the north. It was bigger than she'd expected, a proper working operation, not a one-man subsistence setup. There were cattle in the far pasture, maybe 40 head, and a kitchen garden along the south side of the house that Sarah clearly ran with the same unsentimental efficiency she ran everything else. Ethan was at the fence near the barn, doing something to a post that was leaning. He looked up when she came around the corner. "You should be resting," he said. "You should mind your own business," she said pleasantly. He almost smiled. She was starting to recognize what that looked like on him. A slight tightening around his eyes, a shift in how he held his mouth. He had a face that didn't give much away at full broadcast, but if you watched the smaller signals, there was more going on than he probably intended. "Fair," he said, and went back to the post. She stood a few feet away and watched him work, not because she needed to see it done, but because she needed to be outside and he was outside, and she wasn't quite ready to be alone yet, even if she would have denied that under questioning. The morning was cool and the grass had dew on it, and somewhere up the hill a bird was going through its whole entire morning. "Sarah says you've had this place 7 years," she said. "About that. But you run it alone?" "Had a couple of hands over the years. It's just me and Sarah now. The size is manageable for 2 if you work it right." 2 people can't work 40 head of cattle. He glanced at her, and this time it wasn't almost a smile. It was actually one, small and quick. "You know cattle." "I know enough. My father had a small operation when I was young, before." She stopped. "Before," he repeated, not as a question, just acknowledging that there was a before and that she didn't have to explain it. "I can work," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not asking for charity." "I didn't offer charity. You offered a place to recover, which is different." "Is it?" He straightened up from the fence post and looked at her. "You're trying to find a way to be in debt to me so you have something to be angry about." The directness of that hit her somewhere between the ribs. She opened her mouth and then closed it again, which was not a thing she usually did. "That's," she started. "Probably out of line," he said. "I'm sorry." "It's not wrong," she said before she could stop herself. He looked at her. She looked at him. The bird kept going up on the hill. "It's easier," she said finally. "If I know what I owe, if there are rules, if I know what's expected." She looked away toward the cattle. "The not knowing is the worst part. Always has been." "Then I'll tell you what's true," he said. "You don't owe me anything. You're welcome here as long as you need. And if you want to work, there's work, and you'll be paid the same as any hand I've had. Those are the rules. That's what's expected." She turned back to look at him. "That's it?" she said. "That's it." "You're a strange man, Ethan Ward." "Probably," he agreed. The message came back from Callow Creek on the 6th day. A boy rode up the hill at mid-morning and handed Ethan a folded paper and waited while Ethan read it and then rode away again. And Clara watched all of this from the garden where she'd been helping Sarah pull weeds, because weeding was something she could do without putting strain on the parts of her that were still healing, and because doing something with her hands kept her from going sideways inside her own head. Ethan came to her. He didn't try to ease into it. "The man who handles Blackwell's transactions in Callow Creek says the baby was sold to a couple passing through," he said. "Name of Mercer. They were heading east, toward Harlan County. Clara's hands went still in the dirt. Harlan County, she said. That's what the message says. She looked up at him. That's 3 days' ride. 2 if the weather holds. She stood up slowly, her knees complaining. Can you get more? A name, an address, anything more specific than a county. I'm going to try. I sent a second message before I came to find you, asking for everything my contact has. It'll take a few more days. She nodded. She was doing the thing again, the thing she'd trained herself to do, going somewhere else inside while her body managed the immediate moment. But this time, something was fighting her on it, something small and fierce that wanted to feel this, that said she had a name and a direction now, and that was different from having nothing. That was something. That was more than she'd had 6 days ago. Thank you, she said, and because she needed to not look at him right then, for the message. You don't have to thank me for that either, he said. I know I don't, she said. I'm doing it anyway. Sarah appeared from around the side of the house with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to each of them with the air of a woman who had been listening from inside and decided this moment required coffee. Clara took hers and wrapped both hands around it, even though it was warm enough outside that she didn't need the heat. Mercer, she said. That's the name. She turned it over in her mind. A couple passing through, heading east. A name and a county and a direction. Her daughter was alive, so the message hadn't said otherwise, and Ethan's contact would have mentioned it if the news was bad in that particular way, because bad news was always easier to share than people thought. She was alive and she had a name above her that wasn't her mother's name, and Clara would have to do something about that. But she could do something about that, and that was the first time in 6 days that doing something had felt like a real option rather than a wish. She drank her coffee. Victor Blackwell's name didn't come up again until 2 weeks later, and when it did, it wasn't in a message or a rumor. It was in person. Clara was out by the east fence doing the thing Ethan had started showing her, reading the land for where the cattle were drifting, understanding the small signs that told you a fence line was weakening before it actually broke. She'd discovered she was good at it, or at least she was learning fast, which wasn't the same thing but felt like it. Ethan said she asked better questions than most hands he'd had, which she'd taken as a compliment even though he said it like it was just a statement of fact. She heard the horses before she saw them, 3 riders coming down from the North Trail, which was unusual because the North Trail didn't go anywhere you'd be coming from unless you deliberately come around the long way to avoid being seen on the main road. She watched them come down. The man in front was not Victor. She didn't know him. Big through the chest, wearing a coat that had seen better years, riding a gray horse with a cut on its left foreleg that someone hadn't treated properly. The 2 men behind him she also didn't know, but they had the look of men who'd been hired for their size rather than their judgment. They stopped when they saw her. Looking for Ward, the big man said. He's not here, Clara said. This was true. Ethan had ridden south to talk to a neighboring rancher about a shared water line. The big man looked at her for a moment. You the woman he bought down in Callow Creek? It wasn't a question. I work here, Clara said. He looked around, taking in the fence, the pasture, the house up the hill. Tell him Dolan came by. Tell him Mr. Blackwell wants a conversation about some property he believes is being held on this land without proper authorization. Clara kept her face still. I'll pass that along. You do that. Dolan looked at her one more time, and in that look was everything Victor had always communicated through people like this. That she was a problem someone was going to resolve, that she had not actually gone anywhere, that the transaction that had moved her from one place to another could be revisited if the right argument was made. You have a good day now. He turned his horse, and the 3 of them rode back the way they'd come, up the North Trail, disappearing into the tree line. Clara stood at the fence with her hand resting on the top rail and watched them go. Her heart was going faster than she'd like. She breathed through it, slow and deliberate, the way Sarah had shown her. In through the nose, 4 counts, out through the mouth, 4 counts, until her heartbeat came back down to something she could work with. Then she turned and walked back up to the house to wait for Ethan. He came back at dusk, and she told him about Dolan before he'd even gotten his horse unsaddled, standing at the barn door with her arms folded and her voice flat and even, just the facts, what was said and how it was said, and the direction they'd come from. Ethan listened without interrupting, When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, his hand still resting on his horse's neck. "He's going to say you're still his," Ethan said. "Yes. He's going to find a way to make that argument look legal." "He's done it before," Claire said. "The paperwork he had on me, the original contract. I don't know if the sale in Callow Creek actually transferred that cleanly. Victor is careful about those things. He's been careful about those things for years." Ethan turned to look at her. "Are you scared?" She thought about it honestly, which she'd noticed she did more often around him than she'd ever done around anyone else. Answered questions honestly instead of answering them safely. "Yes," she said, "but I'm also angry, and angry's more useful." He held her gaze for a moment. "We're going to need to get ahead of this," he said, "before he makes his move." "I know. There's a man in the county seat, a lawyer named Pratt, who's handled land disputes up here before. He's not cheap, but he's honest, which is rare. If we can get your paperwork looked at before Victor files anything—" "Ethan," she said. He stopped. "I'm not going back," she said. "I want you to know that before we talk about lawyers and paperwork and whatever Pratt costs. I'm not going back to Victor Blackwell, not for any legal argument he makes, not for any price, not for anything. If it comes to that, I'll make other choices." She meant it. He could hear that she meant it, and he looked at her for a long moment with something in his face that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite worry, but was somewhere between the two. "It won't come to that," he said. "You don't know that." "No," he said. "But I'm going to act like it's true and work backward from there. That's generally how I handle things." Clara looked at him in the fading light. This strange, patient, complicated man who had paid more than he should have for a woman he didn't know, and expected nothing back and still somehow wasn't making her feel like she owed him for the not expecting, which should have been impossible. "Your way of handling things is going to get you in a lot of trouble," she said. "Probably already has," he said. And finally, he smiled properly. Not the small, controlled things she'd been catching glimpses of, but a real one, unguarded, and it changed his whole face into something that was almost alarming in how human it was. She looked away before she could decide what she thought about that. "Go stable your horse," she said. "Sarah's got food on." She walked back up to the house, and she did not look back, and her heart was doing the faster thing again, and this time she couldn't entirely blame Victor Blackwell for it. Pratt turned out to be a small man with ink-stained fingers and the kind of eyes that had read too many bad contracts and stopped being surprised by any of them. He came up to the ranch 3 days after Dolan's visit, at Ethan's request, and sat at the kitchen table with Claire's paperwork spread out in front of him, and his reading glasses pushed down to the end of his nose, and said nothing for a very long time. Clara sat across from him. Ethan stood near the window. Sarah brought coffee and then stationed herself near the stove in the way she had of being present without inserting herself, which Clara had come to understand was its own form of support. "The original indenture contract from the Missouri family," Pratt said finally, without looking up. 1861. "They had proper authority to assign it forward?" "They said they did," Clara said. "Do you know if they filed with the territorial office?" "I don't know what they filed. I was 17. Pratt turned a page. "The logging outfit in Dakota Territory. Assignment of contract. This one's sloppier. There's a question about whether the foreman had standing to transfer without the primary holder's signature, given that the primary holder was deceased at the time of transfer." He tapped the page. "That's a problem. Not for you, for Blackwell. If this transfer wasn't clean, his ownership claim is built on a defective chain." "Can you prove that?" Ethan said. "I can argue it. Proving it would require records from the Dakota outfit that may or may not still exist." Pratt finally looked up, directly at Clara. "What Blackwell will argue is that the auction in Callow Creek constituted a valid transfer regardless of what came before it, that Ward's purchase superseded any prior irregularities. His problem is that Ward's purchase was made under the assumption of a valid contract, and if the contract was defective to begin with, then what exactly did I buy?" Ethan said. "That's the question he doesn't want asked in court," Pratt said, "because the answer might be nothing legally transferable at all, which would mean the entire chain of possession going back to 61 is void." He took his glasses off and set them on the table. "Mrs. Whitmore, the law in this territory is not your friend. I want to be honest with you about that, but it's also not as clean an instrument as Blackwell thinks it is. His case isn't airtight. There's enough here to fight with." What does fighting cost? Clara said. Pratt named a number. It was a significant number. Clara looked at the table. She did the arithmetic she already knew the answer to. I'll cover it, Ethan said. No, Clara said. Clara, no. She looked at him. We've already talked about this. I won't be bought out of one obligation and into another. That's not what this is. The silence in the kitchen had weight to it. Pratt looked at his papers with the discretion of a man who'd learned when not to watch. It's not an obligation, Ethan said, keeping his voice even. It's a loan. You pay me back when you can or you don't, and either way it doesn't change anything between us. You keep saying things like that. Because I keep meaning them. She looked at him for a moment. He was frustrating in a specific way she hadn't encountered before. He was patient without being passive, and he didn't argue so much as just quietly continue to mean what he said until you ran out of reasons to argue with it. Fine, she said. A loan. Written down. Written down, he agreed. Pratt cleared his throat. I'll need a few days to put together a formal response to any claim Blackwell files. In the meantime, he looked at Ethan. I'd recommend not being caught without witnesses. Blackwell has been known to pursue extra-legal solutions when the legal ones are moving too slowly. I know what Blackwell's been known to do, Ethan said. Then we understand each other. Pratt gathered his papers and stood up, tucking them into the leather case he'd brought. Mrs. Whitmore, it's not a strong position, but it's not no position. That's the most honest thing I can tell you. It's enough, Clara said. Thank you. After Pratt rode back down the hill, Clara stood at the fence line where she'd been standing when Dolan came and looked out at the pasture and tried to think clearly about what the next few weeks were going to look like. Victor would file something, or he'd send men, or he'd do both, because that was how Victor operated. He came at a problem from multiple directions simultaneously so that when you were dealing with one, another was already in motion. She'd watched him do it to other people. She'd never expected to be the problem he was solving. Ethan came to stand beside her. He didn't say anything. He's going to come here, she said. Probably. Not Dolan. Victor himself, eventually. He doesn't let men like Dolan handle things that have become personal, and this has become personal for him. She looked down at her hands on the fence rail. I humiliated him by being bought away from him. That's how he sees it. Not the money. The humiliation. I know men like that, Ethan said. You can't negotiate with men like that. Pratt's paperwork will slow him down, but it won't stop him. Men like Victor don't stop when they run out of legal options. They stop when it costs them more to keep going than to quit. She looked at Ethan. We need to make it cost him. He was quiet, looking at the cattle in the far pasture. What are you thinking? I'm thinking Victor has been operating in this territory for 15 years. He's careful, but careful men still make errors when they're confident nobody's looking. The logging outfit in Dakota, the sloppy transfer Pratt identified. If that paperwork is defective, there are probably others. Other contracts, other people he's held that he didn't have clean title to. She turned to face him fully. If we can find those people, or find those records, we're not just defending against Victor's claim on me. We're giving Pratt something to go on a fence with. Ethan looked at her. That's a different kind of fight than sitting here and waiting for Pratt to argue paperwork. Yes, it is. It means going toward him rather than away from him. It means finding his mistakes before he buries them. She held his gaze. I've been running away from Victor Blackwell for 14 months. I'm tired of running being the only option I have. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I know a man in Callow Creek. Runs the freight office. He's been there 12 years, he's seen everything and everyone that passes through, and he has opinions about Victor that he's never had the legal backing to act on. He paused. It would mean me going down to the creek. I don't love leaving you here. Sarah's here. Sarah's 60. Sarah could stop a charging bull with a look, Clara said, and meant it. Go talk to your man in Callow Creek. I'll be here when you get back. He studied her face. You're not going to do anything while I'm gone. I'm going to work the east fence and help Sarah with the kitchen garden and spend 2 hours in the evening reviewing everything Pratt left, and none of those things should concern you. That's a very specific answer to a general question. You asked a general question. He almost smiled. Almost. I'll be gone 2 days at most. If Dolan comes back, I'll be polite and unhelpful and make note of everything he says and does. Clara. I'm not helpless, Ethan. I know you're not, he said. That's not what worries me. She looked at him. What worries you? He looked back at her with those dark eyes that had gotten considerably less hard to read over the past 2 weeks, which was information she was still deciding what to do with. That you've been through enough, and I would like very much for nothing else bad to happen to you for a while. That's all. She looked away first, which was happening more often now. Go talk to your man, she said, and come back. He left the next morning before dawn. Clara slept badly and woke up early and spent the first hour of gray morning light doing what she'd told him she'd do, working the east fence, checking the posts, noting which ones needed attention. The physical work helped. It always had. Her body had its own way of processing things that her mind couldn't get to, and moving through the cool morning air with her hands occupied and her eyes on concrete problems gave her thoughts somewhere to settle that wasn't the constant low-grade hum of fear she'd been managing for 2 weeks. She was pulling a loose staple from a post when she heard a horse on the north trail. She didn't move immediately. She listened. One horse, moving slowly. Not the quick, purposeful movement of someone with business. More like someone who wanted to arrive looking casual. She set down her fencing tool and walked back toward the barn at a pace that she hoped looked like her own natural pace rather than what it actually was, which was a controlled version of the urge to run. She got to the barn door and stepped inside and found Sarah already standing there, looking out through the gap in the boards at the trail. One rider, Sarah said. I heard. Not Dolan. Wrong horse, wrong size. They watched together through the gap. The rider came down out of the tree line and into the open ground below the house, and Clara saw why Sarah had said wrong size. It was a woman. She was perhaps 50, well-dressed for the territory. Good coat, proper boots, hair that had been pinned up that morning with some care. She rode like someone who'd grown up on horseback and never stopped. She pulled up in the yard and looked around and then called out without getting down. Hello, the house. I'm looking for Ethan Ward. Clara came out of the barn. He's not here. The woman looked at her. Something moved in her face, recognition or the adjustment that comes when what you find is different from what you expected. You're the woman he bought in Callow Creek, she said. Not rude, just stating. I work here, Clara said. The answer was becoming a reflex. My name is Helen Marsh, the woman said. I have land 3 miles east. I've been waiting for the right moment to come up here, and I've decided waiting isn't getting anything done. She looked at Clara steadily. I heard about what happened at the auction. I've also heard that Blackwell has sent men up here, and that there may be a legal dispute in progress. She paused. I have information that might be useful to whoever is fighting Victor Blackwell. I've been waiting for someone who might actually fight him. Clara looked at her for a long moment. She thought about what Ethan had said. Don't get caught without witnesses. She thought about what she'd said to Ethan. We need to make it cost him. Get down off your horse, she said. Sarah will make coffee. Helen Marsh had owned her land for 8 years, having inherited it from a husband who died of fever in year 2, and whom she had mourned appropriately and then gotten on with things. She was the kind of woman the frontier produced occasionally, sharpened rather than broken by it, with opinions she'd earned and the backbone to keep them. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and laid out what she knew about Victor Blackwell, with the organized precision of someone who had been cataloging it for a long time and waiting for someone to catalog it too. He's been working a scheme on land contracts for at least 6 years, she said. The labor contracts are part of it, but they're not the main thing. What he's actually doing is identifying parcels with weak title, land where the original claim was filed improperly, or where the original owner died without clear succession, and he's been acquiring those defective titles for almost nothing, and then either selling them or using them as leverage. She set down her cup. 3 families I know of in this valley have lost property to him in the last 4 years. 2 of them didn't understand what was happening until it was done. The third one fought him and lost because they couldn't afford what it cost to fight. Can you prove any of this? Clara said. Some of it. Enough to make things difficult for him if it were in the right hands. Helen looked at her. The land office in the county seat keeps records of all filings. Blackwell has been careful, but he's been filing a lot of documents over 6 years, and careful people still make errors when they're filing a lot of documents. There's a pattern if you know how to look for it. How do you know how to look for it? Helen smiled, and it was a thin smile, but a real one. My husband was a surveyor before he got sick. I spent 6 years assisting him. I know what a land record looks like when something's been done wrong to it. Clara sat back. She was thinking fast, and she knew she was thinking fast, and she let herself do it rather than slowing down to be careful. Pratt is handling our legal response to Blackwell's claim on me, but if he had evidence of a pattern, not just a defective transfer in my specific case, but a systematic practice across multiple properties, it becomes a different kind of case, Helen said. It becomes something the territorial government has to pay attention to. Victor Blackwell is one corrupt man working one scheme. That's manageable for the people in power to ignore. Victor Blackwell systematically defrauding landowners across a territorial district is a different kind of problem. When did you decide to bring this to someone? Clara said. When I heard he'd sent men up here to collect you like you were a piece of furniture he'd misplaced. Helen looked at her hands around the coffee cup. I've been watching him for years. I've been telling myself I was waiting for the right moment, the right allies, the right circumstances. But the truth is I was scared. He's a dangerous man, and I'm one woman with a piece of land I can't afford to lose. She looked back up at Clara. But you're still here. After everything he did to you, you're still here, and you're fighting him. So I decided that if you could do that, I could at least come up a hill and tell someone what I know. Clara looked at her for a long time. Ethan will be back tomorrow, she said, and we're going to need to send a message to Pratt. Can you bring what you have? The records? Whatever documentation you've collected? I can bring it. Then come back tomorrow evening. Bring everything. Helen nodded. She stood, set down her cup, picked up her coat from the back of the chair. Then she paused. I heard you fought, she said. After the auction, the logging outfit, before Blackwell. I heard you tried to run twice. Clara kept her face neutral. People talk. They do. Helen looked at her with something that wasn't quite admiration, but was adjacent to it. I'm glad you're still standing, she said, and walked out. Sarah waited until the sound of hoofbeats had faded before she spoke. She's genuine, she said. The scared kind of genuine, which is the most trustworthy kind. I know, Clara said. You're going to bring this to Ethan, obviously. And in the meantime, you're going to sit here and not do anything impulsive. Clara looked at her. That is also the plan. Sarah looked back at her with 7 years of knowing Ethan Ward written on her face and what appeared to be the rapid development of a theory about this woman specifically. You're going to be hard to have around, she said. I've been told that before, Clara said. I believe it. Sarah picked up the coffee cups and turned back to the stove. Good thing hard isn't the same as wrong. Ethan came back this following afternoon, a day earlier than he'd said, which Clara logged without commenting on. He came into the kitchen looking road-tired and found Clara and Sarah at the table with a stack of papers between them that Clara had spent the morning organizing into something coherent, and he stopped in the doorway and read the situation. What happened? He said. She told him. All of it. Helen Marsh, the land scheme, the documentation, the theory about the county land records. She told it straight and in order, the way she'd been rehearsing it, and he listened without interrupting, the way he did. When she finished, he pulled out a chair and sat down and looked at the papers. Helen Marsh, he said. I know who she is. Good woman. Smart. She's coming back tonight with her documentation. He looked at Clara. And your man in Callow Creek? She asked. Thomas Greer runs the freight office. He's been keeping records of everything that moves through Callow Creek for 12 years, which includes a number of shipments and transactions connected to Blackwell's operation. He rubbed the back of his neck. He's willing to talk to Pratt. He's been wanting to talk to someone for years, but didn't think anyone would listen. 2 witnesses, Claire said. A pattern of fraud. Defective title chain on my specific contract. It's more than we had a week ago, Ethan said. It's enough to take the fight to him instead of just waiting to be hit. She looked at him steadily. Pratt needs to file something before Victor does. If we can get ahead of his claim, if we can put him in a defensive position instead of us. Clara. I know it's not certain. I know Pratt said the law in this territory isn't our friend. I know Victor has money and connections and 15 years of knowing exactly who to talk to. She stopped. But I'd rather go down fighting forward than spend another day waiting for the next knock on the door. Ethan looked at her across the table. He'd been looking at her a lot over the past weeks, and she'd been looking back, and neither of them had done anything about the thing that had slowly and inconveniently been building in the space between the looking. And this was not the moment to do anything about it either. She knew that. There was too much at stake, and too much unresolved, and she still didn't have her daughter, and she was still not a free woman in any way the law would formally recognize, and getting tangled up in feelings in the middle of a legal fight with a dangerous man was exactly the kind of mistake that got people hurt. She knew all of that. She still found it harder than she'd like to look away from him. "All right," he said. "We go forward." Victor's response came 4 days later. Not through a lawyer, not through Dolan, not through any of the channels Clara had been watching. It came in the form of a fire. The east pasture fence, the section she'd been working when Dolan came the first time, was burning when Ethan saw it from the ridge at dawn. A controlled-looking fire that had taken out 40 feet of post and wire, and more importantly, opened a gap wide enough to let cattle through. 23 head were gone by the time they got out there and started counting. Nobody had seen anything. No riders, no torches, nothing. Ethan stood at the burnt fence line with his jaw set in a way Clara had not seen before. He was angry, properly angry. Not the controlled simmer she'd seen when Dolan came. This was the anger of a man watching years of work get erased because someone had decided his choices were inconvenient for them. "He's sending a message," Clara said. "I got the message," Ethan said, his voice very flat. "He's not done. This is the opening." She stood in the ash and looked at the gap in the fence and thought about Victor the way she'd learned to think about him over 14 months. Not emotionally, not with fear, but as a problem with internal logic. He'll come for the cattle claim next. Argue that animals which strayed from a property involved in a disputed contract are themselves part of the dispute. It's a way to cost you money while Pratt is still filing paperwork. Ethan turned to look at her. "How do you know how he thinks?" "Because I lived in his operation for over a year. I watched him do this to other people." She looked back at him. "He's going to keep chipping at the edges until it costs you more to keep fighting than to give me back. That's his calculation." "His calculation is wrong," Ethan said. "I know that. He doesn't." She held his gaze, and in his face she saw the things she'd been seeing more clearly over the past few days. That this was not, for him, purely a matter of principle or stubbornness, or even the original impulse that had brought him to that auction in Callow Creek. It was something else now, something that had grown in the specific ordinary days of her being here, in the fence work and the kitchen table, and the coffees handed over, and the conversations that had stopped being careful and started being real. She saw it in his face, and she knew he could see her seeing it, and neither of them said it, and the burnt fence smoldered between them in the cold morning air. "We send Pratt the filing today," she said, "before Victor can move on the cattle." "Today," he agreed. She turned and walked back toward the house. Her hands were steady. Her chest was not entirely steady, but that was a separate matter, and she'd had plenty of practice carrying separate matters in separate compartments until there was room to deal with them properly. Behind her, she heard Ethan start moving. Not toward the house, but toward the barn, going to get the horse, going to ride to Pratt himself rather than sending a message, because some things you didn't trust to paper. She didn't look back, but she listened until the sound of his horse's hooves faded south, and she only went inside when she couldn't hear him anymore. Pratt filed on a Tuesday. By Thursday, the entire valley knew about it. That was the thing about frontier territories that people from settled places never quite understood. There was no such thing as a private legal action. The county seat had one courthouse, one land office, one records clerk who also happened to be the postmaster's brother-in-law, and information moved through the social infrastructure of a small, isolated community the way water moved through dry ground, fast, in every direction, finding every crack. By Friday morning, when Clara rode with Ethan down to Helen Marsh's property for what had been planned as a quiet meeting, 3 of Helen's neighbors were already there waiting, and none of them had been invited. There was a man named Cutler who ran sheep on the hill above Helen's east pasture, a younger couple named Aldridge, who'd been trying to prove up on a claim for 2 years, and an older woman, gray-haired and deliberate in her movements, who introduced herself only as Mrs. Fenn and said she'd been waiting for someone to do exactly this for 4 years. Clara stood in Helen's front room looking at these people and felt something she didn't immediately have a name for. Then she recognized it. She'd felt it once before, a long time ago, before everything fell apart. The feeling of being in a room where the people around you were on the same side of the same problem. "How did you all know?" Ethan said. "Greer talks," Cutler said. He was a compact, weathered man with the direct manner of someone who'd spent most of his adult life making decisions alone, and had gotten very efficient about it. Freight office knows everything. Greer wasn't supposed to shh. Ethan stopped. All right. He didn't say much, Helen said. Just that something was finally being done. People filled in the rest themselves. Clara looked at the faces in the room. Mrs. Fenn was watching her specifically, with the focused attention of someone taking a measurement. You're the woman from the auction, she said. Yes, Clara said. She'd stopped qualifying it. Blackwell held my son on a labor contract for 3 years before I found a way to get him out, Mrs. Fenn said. The contract was defective. I knew it was defective. I couldn't afford Pratt, couldn't afford anyone, and by the time I'd saved enough, the contract had run its term anyway. She paused. He's a careful man. He's very good at making sure the people he hurts don't have enough to fight him with. That's the design, Clara said. He keeps people just poor enough and just scared enough that fighting isn't an option they can afford. Can we beat him? The younger man Aldridge said. He had the look of someone who'd asked this question before and gotten unsatisfying answers. Not just slow him down, actually beat him. Clara looked at Ethan. He looked back at her, and in that look was the acknowledgement that this question had become hers to answer, not because he was putting it on her, but because everyone in the room was already looking at her as the person who would know. She turned to the room. Pratt's filing establishes a challenge to the title chain on my contract, which puts Blackwell in a defensive legal position for the first time. Helen's documentation of the land fraud gives Pratt a pattern to argue rather than an isolated case. Greer's freight records show financial transactions that don't match the declared values on at least 6 of Blackwell's property acquisitions over the past 4 years. She paused. Alone, any one of those things is something Victor can manage. Together, they're a problem for him that's harder to make go away quietly. Harder isn't impossible, Cutler said. No, Clara said. But Blackwell's method depends on people being isolated. He picks them off one at a time because one person fighting him is a manageable problem. 5 families and a formal legal filing and documented evidence of systematic fraud, that's a different kind of problem. She looked at Aldridge. I won't tell you it's certain. Nothing on the frontier is certain, but it's the best position any of us have been in since he started doing this, and I think he knows it, which is why he burned Ethan's fence. He burned the fence? Mrs. Fenn said. 4 days ago, 23 head of cattle through the gap. Mrs. Fenn looked at Ethan. I'm sorry. It's manageable, Ethan said. He said it without drama, which Clara had come to understand was how he handled everything that wasn't immediately solvable. He named it, put it in the manageable column, and kept moving. It was an infuriating quality in some ways, and an extremely reassuring one in others. They talked for 2 hours. By the end of it, Cutler had agreed to give Pratt a sworn statement about a water rights dispute with Blackwell that had cost him a season's grazing. The Aldridges had documentation of a surveying irregularity on their claim that matched the pattern Helen had identified in the county records. Mrs. Fenn had the name of 2 other families in the next county over who'd had dealings with Blackwell, and she was willing to ride out and talk to them. It was not an army. It was 6 people in a front room, most of them tired, some of them scared, none of them wealthy, on the wrong side of a powerful man in a territory where power still counted for more than it should. But it was 6 people who had decided, each for their own reasons, that the alternative to acting was worse than the risk of acting, and that was the only foundation anything useful had ever been built on. Riding back up to the ranch that evening, Ethan was quiet for the first part of the ride, which Clara had learned to read as him processing rather than withdrawing. She let him do it. The light was going amber across the hills, and the horses moved steadily, and she was tired in a different way than she'd been tired for weeks. Not the exhausted, hunted tiredness, but the tired of a person who'd spent a day doing something that might actually matter. You were good in there, Ethan said eventually. I just talked. You made people believe it was possible. That's harder than talking. She looked at the trail ahead of them. I don't know if I believe it's possible. I just know it's the only thing I can think of to do. That might be the same thing, he said. She glanced at him sideways. He was looking ahead, his profile against the evening light, that steady face that had given her less and less trouble reading as the weeks went on. She looked forward again. The Mercers, she said. My daughter. Pratt is still working that separately. I know. I need you to tell me honestly. Do you think she's findable? Not what you hope, what you actually think. He was quiet long enough that she knew he was doing what she'd asked, actually thinking rather than reassuring. I think Harlan County is a real lead. I think the Mercers, if they were a respectable couple passing through, didn't go underground with a baby. They went home with one, and they're living somewhere and have a life that can be found. He paused. I think it's going to take time and money and probably someone willing to ride east and ask questions in person. And I think you should have your legal status resolved before you're the one doing that riding, because riding into Harlan County looking for your daughter while Blackwell still has a claim on you is a risk I don't think you should take. So first we deal with Victor. First we deal with Victor. She nodded. She folded that piece of information away into the compartment where she kept her daughter. Sealed, present, not forgotten, not yet openable, and turned her attention back to the immediate problem, which was what she'd trained herself to do and which got harder every time she did it. Victor Blackwell came to the ranch on a Monday, 12 days after Pratt filed. He came alone, which was the most unsettling version of Victor. When he brought men, you knew what kind of conversation it was going to be. When he came alone, he was either very confident or he wanted something specific that required the appearance of civility. Clara saw him coming from the garden and went inside and told Ethan. Ethan came out to the yard and waited. Clara stood in the doorway of the house. She didn't hide. She wasn't going to hide. Victor rode into the yard and stopped and looked at Ethan for a moment, then passed him at Clara in the doorway, and something crossed his face. Not surprise, he was never surprised, but a recalibration. Like he'd expected her to be smaller than she was. Ward, he said. He had a voice that was almost pleasant. That was the thing about Victor that had always bothered her more than anything else about him. He was almost pleasant, almost reasonable, and the gap between the almost and the reality was where everything terrible lived. Blackwell, Ethan said. Victor dismounted, didn't ask permission, just got down and dropped his reins like he was already at home. I thought it might be worth talking before things get any more expensive for both of us. Go ahead and talk, Ethan said. Victor glanced at Clara again. I'd prefer to do this man to man. Then you're going to be disappointed, Ethan said. Whatever you've got to say, you can say in front of her. Something tightened briefly in Victor's face and then smoothed itself out again. All right. He looked back at Ethan. You've made a filing with Pratt. I understand that. I even understand the impulse. You paid good money in Callow Creek and you want to protect that investment. He paused on the word investment, giving it just enough weight to make his meaning clear without being direct enough to be answered directly. What I'm here to tell you is that the filing is going to cost you more than it saves you. The chain of title on that contract is sound. Pratt knows it, and you'll know it once his fees start adding up with no result. Pratt has a different opinion, Ethan said. Pratt's opinion is worth what you're paying him for it. Victor smiled, not at Ethan, but at the situation. I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to offer you a way to resolve this without it getting worse. I'll refund the purchase price from Callow Creek, full amount. You cut ties with the woman, she comes back to settle her contract, and we all move on. Clara kept very still in the doorway. She kept her face still. She had been here before. Not in this yard, not with Ethan standing between her and Victor, but in the general architecture of this moment. The moment where Victor made something sound reasonable, and you felt the ground start to shift under you because he was good at this. He was very good at making the thing he wanted sound like the thing that made sense. No, Ethan said. Victor looked at him. You haven't thought about it. I don't need to. Ward, I'm offering you money and the end of a legal problem. That's a better deal than most people get from me. I don't doubt it, Ethan said. The answer's still no. Victor's almost pleasantness went somewhere else for just a moment. Just a moment. Clara saw it, the thing underneath the reasonable voice, and it was the same thing she'd always known was there. Then it came back. Then I'll let the process run, he said, as if the process were something that happened naturally rather than something he would push with both hands. But Ward, the fence was a mistake. That's not my style. Clara almost made a sound. She controlled it. That's interesting, Ethan said evenly. Since 2 of my neighbors saw a rider on the North Trail that night whose horse matched yours. Matched mine how? Gray, left foreleg, old cut going silver. Not a common combination. Something shifted in Victor's posture, barely perceptible, a micro-adjustment of a man who'd just learned something he hadn't intended to give away. His horse was gray. Clara remembered the gray horse Dolan had been riding the first time he came, Victor's stock. She looked at the horse Victor had come on today. Brown. He'd switched horses. He knew someone had seen. "I'll keep that in mind," Victor said, after a pause that was one beat too long, in case whoever was on that trail turns up with information. He picked up his reins. "My offer stands for a week. After that, things get more complicated." He looked past Ethan at Clara, directly at her, for the first time since he'd arrived. "You've made things difficult," he said. "I want you to understand I don't forget that." "I know you don't," she said. "I've never forgotten you either." Something moved behind his eyes, and then he mounted up and rode out of the yard the way he'd come, easy and unhurried, like a man who had the rest of the day free. Ethan waited until he was out of sight before he turned around. He looked at Clara. "The gray horse," he said. "Dolan was riding it when he came the first time. Victor's breeding stock. Ethan, if the neighbors can identify the horse, they already told me what they saw. I was lying to him about the specifics." She stared at him. "You were bluffing." I wanted to see if he'd react. He switched horses. He switched horses today, which means he knew he'd been seen, which means he did it himself or sent someone on his stock, which amounts to the same thing. Ethan turned and called toward the barn. "Sarah?" Sarah appeared in the barn doorway with the expression of someone who'd been listening from 6 feet away for the duration of the conversation. "I heard," she said. "Can you ride to Cutler's today?" "I can ride to Cutler's right now," she said, and disappeared back into the barn to saddle up. Clara came down from the doorway and stood in the yard. The afternoon felt different now, the quality of the light or the quality of her nerves, she couldn't tell which. "He's not going to wait a week," she said. "He said a week because he thinks it sounds reasonable. He'll move before the end of it." "I know. What are we missing? What's he going to do next that we're not prepared for?" Ethan was thinking. She could see him thinking, that stillness that meant all the activity was happening somewhere she couldn't see. "He came alone," he said. "That means he wanted information more than he wanted to intimidate. He wanted to see who was here, what our position looked like, whether you were—" He paused. "Whether you'd broken yet. Whether you looked like someone who could hold together under pressure." "And?" "And now he knows you haven't. Is that bad?" "Depends on what he does with the information." Ethan looked at the gate where Victor had ridden out. A man like that, finding out you're stronger than he thought, either makes him cut his losses or makes him decide he needs to hit harder to break what regular pressure didn't. "He won't cut his losses," Claire said. "Not yet. I've cost him too much in the way that matters to him." "The humiliation." "Yes." Ethan nodded slowly. "Then we need Pratt to move faster than a week." "Can he?" "If I ride down there today." She looked at him. "You just got back 2 days ago." "The horse is rested." "Ethan, Clara." He said her name the way he'd been starting to say it, without the distance that had been in it at the beginning. Just her name, direct, like something he'd decided to own. "I need to go talk to Pratt, and I need to do it today. And I need you and Sarah to not be here alone." "Helen?" "I'll stop at Helen's on the way and ask her to come up." She looked at him. She wanted to argue, and she knew arguing was the wrong instinct. She'd promised herself she wasn't going to let fear make her rigid, that she was going to stay clear-headed about what the situation actually required versus what she emotionally wanted to do, and what the situation required right now was Pratt moving faster and Ethan making that happen. "Fine," she said. "But, Ethan," she stopped him before he could turn toward the barn. He turned back. She was close enough to him now that she could see the tiredness in his face that he didn't put in his voice. The cost of the last 2 weeks that he'd been carrying the same way she'd been carrying hers, quietly and without performance. "Be careful," she said. I know you know to be careful, but he knows you're the piece of this that I can't." She stopped. She hadn't meant to say that much. He looked at her. He didn't rush to fill the silence she'd left, and she had enough composure not to try to take the words back, because taking them back would have been worse than leaving them there. "I'll be careful," he said quietly. He left within the hour. Helen came up that evening with a rifle and a covered dish, in the manner of a woman who had decided that being frightened was less interesting than being useful. She and Clara and Sarah sat at the kitchen table after dark and talked through what Victor's next move might be and what they could do about each version of it. And Clara was struck again by the specific quality of being in a room with people who were on the same side, how it changed the texture of the fear, didn't remove it but made it workable, made it something you could put on the table and examine rather than something you had to carry alone. It was past midnight when they heard the horses. Not one horse this time, several. Coming down from the North Trail fast, not bothering with casual, which meant either Victor had decided civility was done or someone else entirely had decided to make themselves a problem on the worst possible night. Clara was on her feet before the sound fully registered. Helen already had her rifle. Sarah was at the back window looking out. 4 riders, Sarah said, coming hard. Clara went to the wall where Ethan kept a second rifle and took it down and checked the load with hands that were steady because she made them steady, because she had been through too much to fall apart now in the dark, in a kitchen, while Ethan was away, and her daughter was somewhere east in Harlan County, and she had not come this far and fought this hard and held herself together through worse nights than this one to come apart now. She went to the door. "Clara," Helen said behind her. "I know," Clara said. "Stay back from the window. Sarah, if they get past the yard, you go out the back and ride for Cutler." She opened the door. 4 riders in the yard. Torches. Not Blackwell himself, she could see that much. Dolan in front, and 3 men she half recognized from Callow Creek, the kind of men Victor kept available for the kind of work he didn't want attached to his name. Dolan had a rope. That was specific. That was not ambiguous. "Where's Ward?" Dolan said. "Not here," Clara said. She held the rifle across her body, not raised, not aimed, just present. She was standing in the light from the open door and she knew it, and she'd made a calculation. That being seen clearly was better than being a shadow, that she wanted them to see exactly what they were dealing with before anyone made a decision they couldn't take back. "Then this goes faster," Dolan said, and started to get down. "That'd be a mistake," Clara said. He paused, half off the horse. 1 woman with a rifle. 2 women with rifles, Helen said from behind her, and Clara heard her step out onto the porch. "And I've been shooting longer than you've been working for Victor Blackwell, so if you want to make a calculation, make an accurate one." Dolan looked at Helen, looked back at Clara. His men had gone still, which was a good sign, the kind of still that meant they were thinking rather than committed. "Blackwell sent us to collect what's his," Dolan said. "There's a legal filing disputing that claim," Clara said, "which your employer knows because he was standing in this yard this afternoon. Whatever he told you, he knows the law is involved now, which means what you're doing tonight isn't collection. It's something else. You're 1 woman on a disputed contract. I'm 1 woman who knows every defective land transaction Victor Blackwell has conducted in this territory for 6 years, Clara said. And so does Pratt. And so do 3 families who have given sworn statements. And so does Thomas Greer at the freight office in Callow Creek, whose records are now in the custody of a lawyer." She let that land. She watched it land. She watched Dolan's face do the calculation she needed him to do. "You came here for a simple collection job. What I'm telling you is it's not a simple job. It's never been a simple job, and the man who told you it was hasn't told you what's actually at stake tonight." The yard was very quiet. One of the men behind Dolan said something low that she couldn't hear. Dolan sat back on his horse fully, the dismounting motion abandoned. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," Clara said. He looked at her for a long moment, and in his face she saw something she hadn't expected. Not defeat, not anger, but a kind of uncomfortable reckoning, the look of a man who'd just understood that the job he'd taken on had more corners than he'd been shown. Then he turned his horse, and his men turned theirs, and 4 riders went back up the North Trail into the dark. Clara stood on the porch until she could no longer hear them. Then she lowered the rifle and her hand shook, properly shook, for the first time all night. And she let them, because there was no one coming and the yard was empty and she had earned 30 seconds of shaking. Helen came to stand beside her, said nothing. That was the right thing to do. After a moment, Clara straightened up. "I need to send a rider to Ethan," she said. "Tonight." "I'll go," Sarah said from the doorway, already in her coat. Clara turned to look at her. The old woman had the rifle she kept for herself slung over one shoulder and her horse's bridle in one hand, and she looked at Clara with the expression of someone who had been through several difficult decades and found that difficult decades were navigable if you kept moving. Be safe, Clara said. Always am, Sarah said, which was probably not strictly true, but Clara understood the spirit of it. She listened to Sarah ride out, and then she went inside, and she sat down at the kitchen table, and for the first time since the night on the auction platform, she let herself think about what came after. Not plan. She'd been planning for weeks. Actually think about what after looked like. A legal status that no one could dispute. A daughter found and brought home. A piece of this land that she'd worked with her own hands. A man who looked at her like she was a person and had been consistent about that for going on a month now, which was longer than anyone had been consistent about anything in her direction for a long time. She put her head down on her folded arms on the kitchen table and let herself want those things, properly want them, for exactly as long as she could stand it. Then she lifted her head, and Helen was sitting across from her with 2 cups of coffee, and Clara picked up hers and held it and waited for morning. Ethan came back before dawn. Clara heard the horse in the yard and was at the door before she'd fully decided to stand up, which told her something about herself she didn't spend time examining. He came through the gate looking like a man who'd ridden through the night and made decisions the whole way, and when he saw her standing in the doorway, he stopped for just a moment. Not a long moment. Not a dramatic one. Just the half-second of a person who'd been moving fast toward something and had arrived and needed to register that it was still there. Sarah found you, Clara said. 2 hours south of Pratt's office. He came up to the porch. She told me about Dolan. It's handled. I know, she told me that too. He looked at her face in the thin pre-dawn light. You all right? I'm fine. Clara. I'm fine, Ethan. Hands stopped shaking an hour ago. Something moved in his expression. Relief, she thought, or the specific kind of exhaustion that comes when you've spent several hours imagining the worst and then found out it didn't happen. He sat down on the porch step and put his elbows on his knees, and for a moment he just breathed, and she sat down beside him because the step was there and he was there, and it was almost morning and they were both tired. Pratt filed the emergency injunction last night, he said, before I even got to him. He'd already heard about Dolan's first visit and had been preparing it. The territorial judge has it this morning when he opens his office. What does that do? It freezes Blackwell's claim. He can't move legally while the injunction is in effect, and it forces him to respond in court to the fraud allegations rather than just defending against our challenge to the contract chain. He rubbed the back of his neck. Greer came through. He brought his freight records to Pratt in person yesterday afternoon. 12 years of shipments and transactions, all of it documented, and Blackwell's name is on a lot of it in ways that don't match the declared values on the land filings. Clara absorbed that. So he's on defense. For the first time since he started doing this, yes. Helen appeared in the doorway behind them with coffee, looked at the two of them sitting on the step, and left the cups without comment, which was one of the many things Clara had come to appreciate about Helen Marsh. They sat with the coffee and the coming light and the particular quiet of a morning after a night that could have gone badly and didn't. The hills were going from black to gray to the first suggestion of color, and somewhere down the slope a bird was doing what it always did, regardless of what the humans were up to, and Clara thought that was probably the sanest thing in the whole landscape. He's not done, she said. No, Ethan agreed, but he's going to have to be more careful now. Every move he makes while that injunction is in effect is documented. He can't send Dolan again without it being witnessable obstruction. Victor doesn't make mistakes when he's being watched, Claire said. He waits. Then we use the waiting. She looked at him. The Mercers. He nodded slowly. Pratt thinks your legal status can be formally resolved within 6 to 8 weeks, depending on how fast the territorial court moves. Once the contract chain is declared void, and he thinks it will be given everything Greer brought, you'll have formal free papers that nobody can dispute. 6 to 8 weeks. Maybe less. She looked at her coffee cup. 6 to 8 weeks was a long time and not a long time, depending on which side of it you were on. Her daughter had been in Harlan County for over a month already. She was growing. She was being held by people whose names Clara knew, but whose faces she'd never seen, in a house she'd never been to, in a county she'd never set foot in. I want to go get her the moment the papers are signed, Clara said. I want that to be understood. The day Pratt hands me those papers, I'm riding east. I know, Ethan said. I'm going with you. She turned to look at him. If you'll have me, he said. Not presuming, just stating availability. Same way he did everything, to direct without being pushy, present without crowding. You can't leave the ranch for Sarah and Cutler can manage it for 2 weeks. Cutler's been offering to help since the fence burned, and it would make him feel useful, which he needs. He met her eyes. I've been in Harlan County before. I know the territory. And you shouldn't ride 2 days alone to a county where you don't know anyone to confront people who are holding your daughter and may not want to give her up. She hadn't thought about that part. She'd been so focused on finding the Mercers that she hadn't fully thought about the conversation that would happen when she got there. 2 people who'd been traveling with a baby for over a month, who'd named her probably, who thought of her as theirs now. That conversation was not going to be simple. They may fight it, she said. They may, he agreed. That's why you want a witness, and someone who can ride fast if it goes wrong. She looked at him for a long moment. The morning was coming in properly now, light moving across the hill, and his face was clear in it, tired, honest, entirely himself, which she had come to understand was a more consistent thing in him than she'd believed possible in any person. He was the same man at dawn after a hard night that he was in the middle of the afternoon on a quiet day, and that sameness, that simple reliability, had done something to her that she suspected was irreversible. All right, she said. You come. He nodded once. That was enough for both of them. Victor Blackwell appeared in the territorial court 11 days later, represented by a lawyer from the capital who cost more than Pratt's entire annual billing and who had the sleek, expensive manner of a man who'd won a lot of cases through sheer economic attrition. He filed a counter-response that was technically sophisticated and practically ambitious, challenging the standing of Greer's records as business rather than legal documents, questioning the chain of custody on Helen's land filing evidence, and arguing that the labor contract in question had been properly assigned under territorial statute regardless of the conditions under which it originated. It was a good argument. Clara read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table with Pratt's annotated copy, and she could see the architecture of it, where it was strong, and where it was hoping nobody would look too closely. He's going after Greer's credibility, she said. Pratt, who had ridden up that afternoon specifically to go through it with her, nodded. That's his best angle. The freight records are the spine of the fraud case, and if he can get them declared inadmissible or unreliable, the pattern argument weakens. Can he do it? He can try. Greer's been keeping those records for 12 years, and they're meticulous, but Blackwell's lawyer is going to put him on a stand and go through every entry looking for inconsistencies. Pratt paused. He's a good man, but he gets nervous. I've seen him in conversation. A skilled lawyer working him over for 2 hours might find enough hesitation to cast doubt. Clara thought about Thomas Greer, who she'd met once briefly at Helen's. A slight, careful man with the particular anxiety of someone who'd been keeping a secret for years, and wasn't entirely sure the secret had been worth keeping. What does he need? Confidence, mostly, to understand that the records speak for themselves and that his job is to explain them, not to defend them. Pratt looked at her over his glasses. He'd respond better to that coming from you than from me, I think. Why from me? Because you're what the records are about. Abstractly, he's been documenting a fraud scheme. But you're the reason it matters. You're the face of what Blackwell's been doing, and I think if Greer can hold that in his mind while he's on that stand, he'll hold together better than if it's just business records and legal procedure. Clara sat with that. When's the hearing? 3 weeks. I'll go talk to him. She rode down to Callow Creek the next morning, alone, which Ethan accepted with only a brief pause and the information that Cutler would be working the north pasture all day and could be within shouting distance if she needed him. She took the rifle. She took the main road, not the north trail, in full daylight, and she rode through Callow Creek at a pace that said she had somewhere to be and was getting there by choice. Thomas Greer's freight office was a narrow building that smelled like sawdust and old paper, and the specific mustiness of 12 years of organized record-keeping. He looked up when she came in and went very still, the way people went still around her now. Not because she frightened them, exactly, but because she had become, through no particular intention of her own, the visible center of something that had been invisible for a long time. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "Mr. Greer." She sat down in the chair across from his desk without waiting to be asked. "Pratt tells me you're going to be on a witness stand in 3 weeks." "He told me the same thing." "Are you scared?" He blinked at the directness of it. "Yes." "That's honest," she said. "I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to hear it properly. Those records you kept, 12 years of them, they're not just evidence in a legal case. They're the reason 3 families might get their land back. They're the reason the next person Victor Blackwell decides to run his scheme on might have somewhere to turn." She paused. "They're part of why I might actually get my daughter back." Greer looked at his hands on the desk. "When you're on that stand," she said, "and Blackwell's lawyer is trying to make you feel like you've done something wrong by keeping those records, I want you to remember that you did the one thing most people in this territory haven't done. You paid attention. You wrote it down. You kept it even when nobody was asking for it yet." She met his eyes. "That's not nothing, Mr. Greer. That's actually everything." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "My wife told me I should have burned them years ago. Said it would cause me trouble." "Your wife was probably right about the trouble part," Clara said. Something in him shifted, steadied. "I'll hold together," he said, "on the stand." "I know you will," she said. And she did, actually. She could see it in him now, the thing that had made him keep the records in the first place. A stubborn, quiet refusal to let things disappear just because powerful people wanted them to. She rode back up to the ranch in the afternoon light and told Ethan the conversation had gone well, and he looked at her with that expression she'd stopped pretending not to notice, the one that was less about the information she was giving him and more about her specifically, and she looked back at him, and they stood in the yard in the late autumn light, not saying the thing they hadn't said yet, and then Sarah called from the house that supper was ready, and they both went inside. Some things moved at their own pace, regardless of how much urgency surrounded them. Clara had made her peace with that. Mostly. The hearing lasted 4 days. Clara sat in the back of the territorial courtroom, which was a single room that also served as the county commission chambers, and she was told the venue for the occasional dance, and watched Blackwell's expensive lawyer dismantle and reassemble arguments with the precision of a man who'd been paid enough to be very thorough. She watched Pratt push back with the specific bulldog quality she'd hired him for. She watched Greer on the stand for 3 hours on the second day and was not disappointed. He was nervous. He stumbled twice on dates, but the records were exactly what he said they were, and 12 years of meticulous documentation had a weight that nervousness couldn't undo. Helen testified. Cutler testified. Mrs. Fenn testified and said exactly what she meant in exactly the words she meant it, with the precision of a woman who had been waiting 4 years to say it in a room where someone was required to write it down. Victor sat at the plaintiff's table through all of it, with that flat, calculating stillness, and that face that gave nothing away, and Clara watched him more than she watched the lawyers, because the lawyers were performing for the judge and Victor was thinking, and what he was thinking mattered more than what the lawyers were saying. On the 4th day, the judge recessed for deliberation. They waited 2 more days after that. Clara spent them working. There was always work on a ranch. It didn't pause for legal proceedings or personal crises or the general uncertainty of everything. And she had found over the past weeks that this was not the burden she'd once thought it was. The work was its own kind of answer. You couldn't fix the courtroom from the north pasture, but you could fix the fence, and fixing the fence was real and immediate and left something solid where there had been a gap, and there was something in that which kept a person sane. She was replacing a rotten post at the east fence, the same stretch that had burned, rebuilt now, when Ethan came riding fast from the direction of the road. She saw him coming and straightened up and put down the post hammer and waited because there was nothing else to do. He pulled up. He was out of breath, which meant he'd ridden hard, which meant the news was something. "Pratt sent a rider," he said. The judge ruled. She looked at him. "Contract chain void from origin," he said. The transfer from the logging outfit was found defective under territorial statute. Everything built on it, including Blackwell's claim, is legally nullified. He paused, and she could see him working to keep his voice even, working almost as hard as she was. And the judge referred the land fraud allegations to the territorial prosecutor's office for formal investigation. Victor can't dispose of property or transfer assets while that investigation is open. Clara stood at the fence with the post hammer in her hand and the autumn light on the hills around her, and thought about being 26 years old on a platform in the rain, and thought about her wrists in irons, and thought about the sound her daughter had made, one small breath before the rider took her east, and felt something move through her that she did not try to name or contain or manage into something more convenient. She sat down on the ground, not because her legs gave out. They held. They'd been holding for a long time. She sat down because she chose to, because the ground was solid and real and she wanted to feel it, and she pressed one hand flat against the earth and felt the cold of it, and the particular realness of dirt and grass and the roots underneath, and she stayed there for a moment while the thing moved through her and did what it needed to do. Ethan got off his horse and sat down on the ground beside her, not saying anything, not making it into a moment, just sitting there the way he sat there, present and steady, because that was who he was. After a while, she said, "I need Pratt to draw up the free papers." "He's already started," Ethan said. She looked at him. "Of course he is." "I told him to start them the morning before the ruling, because Pratt's better at the law than he is at optimism, and I figured one of us should be." She looked at his face, this face she knew now, every corner of it, every small signal she'd learned to read over weeks of proximity and honesty, and the specific intimacy of people who'd been through something difficult together and come out still knowing what they thought of each other. She knew what she thought of him. She'd known for a while. She'd been waiting for a moment that didn't have a crisis in it. "Ethan," she said. "Clara," he said at exactly the same time. They both stopped. "You go," she said. He looked at the hills for a moment and then back at her, and he said it the way she'd been learning was the only way he knew to say things. Straight, without decoration. "I think you know that this has become something different than what it started as for me. I'm not asking you to feel the same way, and I'm not going to make it difficult if you don't. But I didn't want to keep not saying it, because I've been not saying it for long enough that it's started to feel like a lie. And I don't lie to you." She looked at him sitting on the cold ground in the autumn light, with the hills behind him, and thought about the auction platform, and thought about the chains, and thought about every version of herself that had learned to stop wanting things because wanting them was just a longer way to get hurt. And she thought about how that had been the right strategy for a long time, and was now, for the first time she could remember, the wrong one. "I know," she said. "I feel the same way. And I need you to understand that I don't know yet how to be a person who... I haven't been a person who got to want things without it costing me everything. So I'm probably going to be bad at this sometimes." "I'm not easy to be around either," he said. "I work too much and I go quiet when I should talk, and I make decisions before I tell people I've made them." "I noticed." "I know you noticed." She looked at him. Something pulled at the corner of her mouth. "We're describing a disaster." "Probably," he agreed, and the thing that had been an almost smile for weeks arrived fully, real and unguarded. And she let herself look at it this time instead of looking away. She didn't say anything else, and neither did he, but she leaned her shoulder against his, and he didn't move away, and they sat there together on the cold ground at the east fence in the afternoon light until the practicalities of the world reasserted themselves, which they always did, but took their time about it this once. They rode east to Harlan County 12 days later, the morning after Pratt handed Clara a document with the territorial court seal on it, that said in formal language what she already knew in every bone, that she was a free person, that she had been a free person in the eyes of the law since the defective contract that had never legally bound her, and that no subsequent claim on her person or her labor could be made by any party in this territory or any other. She folded it and put it inside her coat, close, and rode east. The Mercers were not the monsters she'd prepared herself for. That was the complicated truth of it, the one she spent a long time afterward turning over in her mind. They were a couple in their late 40s, childless after years of trying, who had passed through Callow Creek at the wrong time and been approached by Victor Blackwell's man with an offer that the law of the territory had not clearly prohibited, and who had taken a baby home to a farm in Harlan County and spent 6 weeks falling in love with her. Their farmhouse was small and clean. The woman, whose name was Ruth, had sewn the baby a quilt. The man, James, had built a small wooden cradle that sat near the kitchen stove. Clara stood in their front room with her court papers in her hand and looked at a woman who was holding her daughter, who had grown in 6 weeks, who had Ruth Mercer's borrowed smell and James Mercer's borrowed quilt, and who did not know her mother's face, and felt the full weight of what the frontier could do to people. All of it, the cruelty and the longing, and the damage that rippled out from one bad man's calculations and touched everything it reached. Ruth Mercer was crying before Clara said anything. She knew what Clara being there meant. She'd known, Clara thought, on some level since the day she'd taken that baby, that a mother existed somewhere, that the clean transaction Victor had sold them was not as clean as he'd claimed. "We didn't know," James said. His voice was rough. "Not the full of it. We were told there was no mother who wanted her." "I know," Claire said. And she did know, which was the harder part. "He told you what you needed to hear to make you say yes. That's what Victor does." She did not make it fast. She sat with them for an hour. She let Ruth hold the baby for that hour because Ruth had spent 6 weeks loving her, and that was real. That counted for something, even though it didn't change what had to happen. She looked at her daughter's face, this face she'd only seen for minutes on the morning she was born, and memorized it with the focused desperation of someone who had been waiting to do this for 6 weeks. When she took her daughter from Ruth's arms, Ruth made a sound that Clara would not describe to anyone, ever, because some sounds belong to the people who made them. "I'm sorry," Clara said, and meant it. "I know," Ruth said. "I know you are." Ethan waited outside with the horses. When Clara came out with the baby, he looked at her face first, and then at the bundle in her arms, and he came to her carefully, the way he'd come to her on everything, direct but not rushing, present but not crowding. "All right," he said. "No," Clara said honestly. "But we're leaving anyway." She had not thought about what she would feel riding away from that farmhouse. She'd thought about arrival, about the confrontation, about the papers and the arguments and the possibilities. She had not thought about what it felt like to have her daughter back, warm and real and breathing against her chest on horseback, and to feel the specific agony of knowing that getting her back had cost 2 other people something they could not recover. There was no version of that story where everyone was all right. Victor Blackwell had made sure of that when he'd lifted a baby out of a mother's arms in the rain, and the damage ran in every direction from that point, touching everyone it reached. Clara held her daughter and felt that damage and did not try to make it smaller than it was. "What are you going to name her?" Ethan said, riding beside her. Clara looked down at the face against her chest. She'd been thinking about this for 6 weeks, which meant she'd been thinking about it in the sealed compartment along with everything else she couldn't open yet, and now she could open it. "May," she said. "Her name is May." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "May Whitmore." "May Whitmore," Clara said. He nodded, rode beside her. Didn't fill the silence with anything unnecessary, which was one of the things she'd stopped taking for granted about him. They were back at the ranch by the end of the week. Victor Blackwell was formally charged by the Territorial Prosecutor's Office 6 weeks after that, on 4 counts of fraudulent land acquisition and 2 counts of unlawful labor contract assignment. His expensive lawyer negotiated because that was what expensive lawyers did, and the final outcome was not everything Clara had wanted. It never was. That was another thing the frontier had taught her. That justice was a direction more often than it was a destination. But Victor sold his holdings in the territory to cover the settlement. He left Callow Creek by winter. The people who'd lost land to him didn't get all of it back, but 3 of the 4 families got enough to keep going, and Mrs. Fenn got a formal acknowledgement that the contract on her son had been unlawful, which was the thing she'd needed most. Pratt framed the court order and put it on his wall. Clara didn't ask why. She thought she understood. Sarah stayed through winter and then announced in the spring that her sister in New Mexico needed help, and she was going, which she said with the manner of someone who had watched 2 people not say things to each other for long enough and had decided her work here was done. She left on a Tuesday with a horse, a packed bag, and a look at Clara that contained approximately 7 years of opinion compressed into 3 seconds. "Don't waste time," Sarah said. "I don't intend to," Clara said. "Good." Sarah hugged May, who was 5 months old and had opinions about being hugged, and then rode south without looking back, which was very Sarah. The spring on that land was something Clara had not been prepared for. She'd arrived in fall and survived the winter, and then the world turned green in a way that felt, after everything, almost aggressively hopeful. The creek ran high from snowmelt, and the cattle fattened up on the new grass, and May, who had developed a strong preference for being outside, could be put on a blanket in the yard and would conduct lengthy investigations of whatever was within arm's reach, with the focused determination of someone who decided the world was interesting and intended to examine all of it. Clara watched her daughter one afternoon from the porch, May sitting on her blanket in the spring sun, pulling at the grass with both hands, making a sound that was working toward being a laugh, and thought about the auction platform, about the rain, about the way the auctioneer had held the lantern to her face and named her value. She thought about all the years before that night, the Missouri family, the logging outfit, the long accumulation of people who had looked at her and seen either a problem or a price. She thought about who she'd had to become to survive all of that, the sealed compartments, the trained stillness, the careful mathematics of what was safe to want. She didn't regret who she'd had to be. That person had kept her alive long enough to be standing on this porch in the spring sun watching her daughter investigate grass. You didn't discard the thing that saved you, even when you didn't need it the same way anymore. But she had learned, in the months since Callow Creek, something she hadn't expected to learn, that belonging wasn't a thing that happened to you. It wasn't granted by paperwork or by the absence of chains or by someone powerful enough choosing to see you as a person. It was a thing you built, the way you built a fence, post by post, in all kinds of weather, in the specific place where you decided to stand. Ethan came around the side of the house from the barn and stopped when he saw her on the porch, the way he sometimes stopped, taking stock, the habit of a man who'd learned to pay attention to small things. He looked at May on the blanket and then up at Clara, and she looked back at him, and the thing that had been building since that rainy night in October was not a secret anymore and hadn't been for months, but they still had the habit of looking at each other like it was the first time they'd allowed themselves to, which she suspected was a habit worth keeping. "Fence is holding," he said, coming up to the porch. "I know, I checked it this morning." "I know you did. I saw." He leaned against the porch post, looking out at May. "She's going to walk soon. Pratt thinks she'll be early." He glanced at her. "Pratt doesn't have children." "Pratt knows a lot of things despite not having children. Pratt's been spending a lot of time up here for a lawyer whose case is closed." "He likes the coffee," Clara said. "He likes talking to you," Ethan said, without particular inflection, because he didn't do jealousy as a weapon, which was one of many things she'd discovered about him that she kept as evidence against the version of herself that had believed all people used whatever they had. "He likes the coffee," Clara said again. "And I like talking to him. He knows things." Ethan nodded. May made a decisive sound from her blanket and toppled sideways and righted herself with the expression of someone who had not done that on purpose but was claiming she had. "She's stubborn," Ethan said. "She comes by it naturally," Clara said. He looked at her sideways. "Which side?" "Both, probably. You've been known to be stubborn a time or two." "I prefer determined." "You would." He smiled, properly, openly, the way she'd been getting out of him since the ground at the east fence, and she still thought it changed his whole face into something almost alarming, and she had stopped trying to look away from it. She thought about what she would tell May someday. Not the whole of it at once, not everything. A child needed pieces, needed the story to come in doses she could carry. But the center of it, the thing that mattered underneath the courts and the lawyers and the fire and the long cold ride east, that people will try to name your value for you. They'll do it from platforms and in courtrooms and in small, daily ways that add up to the same thing. And the work of a life is not to convince them they're wrong. You'll waste yourself doing that, and some of them will never hear you anyway. The work is to know your own value so clearly, so stubbornly, so absolutely that their arithmetic can't reach it. That's the thing they can never take, if you don't let them. Not the chains, not the platform, not the paperwork, the knowing. She hadn't known it perfectly. She'd had days, even after the papers, even after the judge's ruling, when she'd wake up and the old mathematics would be running in her before she was fully conscious, calculating what was safe, what was expected, how much of herself was too much to risk. That didn't stop. She didn't think it entirely stopped for anyone who'd spent years in that particular dark. But you got better at recognizing it, better at saying, "That's old fear, not current information." Better at choosing, each time, to stand up in it anyway. May was pulling herself to her feet, using the air, using nothing, using the pure stubborn determination of a creature who had decided it was time and was going to do it whether or not she was ready. Clara stepped off the porch and went to her, crouched down in the spring grass and held out her hands, not to catch her, to give her something to aim for. May looked at her hands and then at her face and made the sound that had been building toward a laugh for 3 months, and finally, on this afternoon in the spring sun, arrived as one. Small and new and completely itself. Clara caught her when she fell, which she did almost immediately, and held her in the grass and felt the realness of her, the solid, small weight of this person she'd spent 6 weeks not being able to open the compartment for, and thought, here. This is the here. Not the before and not the after, but this specific place, this specific light, this grass and this child and this man coming down from the porch to sit in the grass beside them both. It wasn't the life she'd planned. She hadn't been given the chance to plan one. It was the life that had come together out of 100 decisions made in bad circumstances by imperfect people who kept going anyway, out of one man's late-arrived refusal to keep looking away, out of one woman's stubborn refusal to stay down, out of small acts of courage by people like Helen and Greer and Mrs. Fenn and Sarah, who had each at some point decided that the thing happening in front of them was their business after all. The frontier was not kind. It had never been kind. It chewed through people and didn't apologize for it, and left the landscape marked with the cost in ways that lasted longer than the people did. Clara knew that. She had learned it the hard way, and she would not forget it. But here, on this hillside, in this particular spring, she had built something, post by post, in all kinds of weather, in the exact place she'd decided to stand. She looked at Ethan sitting beside her in the grass, May in her lap, the ranch around them, and the hills beyond, and she thought, yes, this. However imperfect, however unplanned, however earned, yes. May grabbed a fistful of her hair and pulled, which was not a metaphor. It was just a baby doing what babies did. Ow, Clara said. Ethan reached over and gently freed her hair from May's grip with the patient dexterity of someone who had been practicing this for months and was resigned to more practice ahead. Thank you, Clara said. Any time, he said. She leaned her shoulder against his, the way she had at the east fence, and the afternoon held them there a while longer, all 3 of them in the spring grass on the hill they'd decided to call home.